Without further ado, it is my privilege to hand the mic, at least sort of symbolically, over to Caroline to introduce our panelists. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Austin. My name is Caroline Rader. I am currently a student fellow for the Wheeler Center, and thank you for joining us this evening to discuss this important and very relevant topic. Before we begin, we just ask that you please keep your microphone muted, have your camera on. If you're comfortable, we encourage you to do so, as our speakers love to see your faces. After our panelists have presented, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions through a Q&A. And further instructions will be given about how to participate, but I encourage you to jot down notes concerning questions you may have throughout the presentation. And without further ado, I'm thrilled to announce our four incredible speakers lined up for you tonight. Our first speaker of the night, Dr. Mark Fiege, is a professor of environmental history here at Montana State University. Our next speaker is Virginia Kelly from the United States Forest Service, and will speak to her position as the Custer Gallatin National Forest Plan Revision Team Leader. Our third speaker is Peter Bennett, Vice President of Friends of Hyalite, which represents many Hyalite interest groups in the area. And lastly, we'll receive insight from Jono McKinney, President and CEO of the Montana Conservation Corps.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you, Eric. Thanks to everybody at the Wheeler Center. This is a great event, and I'm happy to participate. What I'd like to do is, as quickly and as efficiently as possible, give everyone some background on the history of public lands, national forests, the Forest Service, and how these things have changed over time. I think this is essential for understanding something like the current Custer Gallatin National Forest Plan, revisions to it, how people are thinking about the Hyalite area, and so forth. First of all, I think it's really, really important to understand that the public lands, including the national forests, have never meant one particular thing and never served any one particular use. They are astonishingly capacious and flexible in the uses to which they can be put and the meanings that they can contain. And I think you see that demonstrated in the history of the national forests, how people have thought about them, the uses to which they have put the forests, the ways that they have thought about the forests and the meanings they have seen in the forests and so forth. So I think for our purposes, the key decade in which to begin is the 1890s. The 1890s was the decade in which today's national forests originated. At that time in the United States, there was a great deal of concern over the condition of forests, including in the American Wests. There had been mass industrial logging using railroads. There had been mass fires, the beginnings of what we call mega fires. There was a fear that the destruction of forests by fire, by rapid extraction and so forth would affect water flows. This was critically important in the American West, as agriculture there was coming to rely heavily on irrigation. So there was a lot of concern in the country that the forests needed to be conserved. The key piece of legislation that's foundational to all of this is generally known as the Forest Reserve Act of 1891. Forest Reserve Act of 1891. Remarkable piece of legislation. It enabled the president, through executive order or proclamation, to remove land from the public domain and shield it from appropriation and settlement. Essentially taking land out of the larger body of public land that people could appropriate, homestead, and so forth. There are some exceptions to this, but basically it was taking land out of the larger pool of land that people could privatize. This was a remarkable moment because most of U.S. public lands history until this point, with some exceptions, Yellowstone National Park, for example, the whole point of U.S. public lands policy was to privatize that land. Privatization was one of the major goals of public lands policy up until this time. That's crucially important to remember. But 1891, it begins to change. The Forest Reserve Act was remarkable. By 1907, 16 years after the passage of the Forest Reserve Act, the presidents had set aside 150 million acres of national forests. They were called forest reserves in the beginning, but this was the genesis of the national forests. They were renamed in 1907, but this is when you get the creation of today's national forests. A piece of legislation in the 1890s that I think is central to understanding the history of planning is the 1897 Forest Management Act. The first forest reserves were set aside, and it was unclear exactly what these kinds of reservations were to be. The first forest reserve was the Yellowstone Park Timberland Reserve that was on the south and east portion of Yellowstone National Park. And just given the name of that forest reserve and its abutting the national park, some conservationists believe that it was going to be kind of like a mini addition to Yellowstone, that the purpose of a forest reserve was to preserve nature kind of in the way Yellowstone was being preserved. There was a powerful political reaction by Western congressional delegations against the president's authority to set aside forest reserves. The upshot of that was the 1897 Management Act. And that essentially laid out a range of uses that the forests were for. And today we call it multiple use. But forests are for timber, they're for water flows, they're for grazing values, and so forth. It was a very use-oriented piece of legislation. And that piece of legislation in the Forest Service, it's known as the Organic Act. That was the governing law that basically stipulated the kinds of uses people could have in the national forests. Now, here's something really important in all this. Forest Service, the agency is created in 1905, and that's the professional foresters. Someone you ought to remember is Ehlers Koch. Ehlers Koch was a graduate of Montana State College. He went to Yale School of Forestry. He became one of the first U.S. Forest Service forest rangers. He was a remarkable person, and MSU needs to remember who he was. He was a visionary. But the Forest Service was issued a set of regulations. So a forest ranger like Ehlers Koch would have had in his saddlebag or in his pocket a small book authored by the first Forest Service chief, Gifford Pinchot, and it was titled The Use Book. The Use Book introduced a really crucially important idea. The Use Book said right at the beginning, forest reserves are for the purpose of preserving a perpetual supply of timber for home industries, preventing destruction of forest cover, which regulates the flow of streams, and protecting local residents from unfair competition in the use of forest and range. They are patrolled and protected at government expense for the benefit of the community and the home builder. And then further, forest officers are servants of the people. So what the Use Book did, and it was a little book about 135 pages in a pocket, vastly different from the incredible number of tomes that the Forest Service has to use to plan and manage national forests. Basically, what is being posited there is democracy. Sovereign power in the United States arises from the people. It doesn't arise from a king. It doesn't arise from God. It arises from the people. And the Use Book acknowledge that fact. It's basically saying the forests, the national forests, are for the use by the little people, the homesteaders, the people who have small cattle herds, the people who get firewood, the people who hunt, and so forth, the irrigators. That was the principle. But that idea of democracy existed in tension with another feature of the national forests and the Forest Service, and that is the Forest Service was made up of bureaucratic experts. They were people with college degrees, oftentimes advanced degrees in forestry and related fields from schools like Yale or Montana State College. So a great deal of the responsibility, a great deal of the power over the national forests was given to the professionals in the U.S. Forest Service. And Pinchot acknowledging in many ways that tension, between expertise lodged in an agency that has constabulary power. It's limited police power, but police power nonetheless over those lands, but also acknowledging that those forest rangers had to serve the interests of the people, and that tension would continue. It's a really important feature of forest history. Then there's a major turning point. So if you think about the 20th century, think of the great conflicts that divide up the century. World War I for the United States in 1917 to 1918, World War II for the US 1941 to 1945, the Cold War for the United States 1945 to 1989. These were major global struggles. World Wars I and II were total wars. And one of the things that the participants in those global struggles did was to mobilize their entire populations and their landscapes, all the resources that they could, for the purposes of winning the war. And that reoriented the Forest Service gradually over time, away from its grassroots emphasis on democracy and the people, and ever more powerfully orienting it to getting out the cut, to resource extraction, and primarily timber. It was World Wars I, II, and Cold War, which powerfully reoriented the Forest Service away from really even much multiple use and really toward timber extraction. This was the key turning point. And, you know, if you think about what was at stake in those conflicts, especially World War II, what was at stake for American policymakers in the Cold War, in the global struggle against communism and the Soviet Union, you can imagine how everyone in society reorients toward regenerating the resources and the things that people in the society believe they need to have to prevail in that struggle. So a key part of this turn toward resource extraction, getting out the cut, getting out the timber, was a social event, social change, the baby boom. The baby boom was from 1946 to 1964. Along the lines of 75 million children were born during that time. Many of your parents, your grandparents, were born in the baby boom. And the baby boom, of course, with all of those children, millions and millions of children, set up an immense demand for things like houses, for things like elementary schools and stuff like that. Most of the private lands in the Northern Rockies, in the Pacific Northwest, where I'm from and so forth, those had already been cut over. Those were cut over by the 1920s and the 1930s. The remaining stands of timber that the country wanted to provide resources, to supply goods for the baby boom generation, to fulfill the needs of the country in the global, in the total war struggles and the Cold War and so forth. They were going to come from national forests. National Forest, Forest Service foresters and civil engineers by the post-World War II period had an astonishing array of technologies and skills and techniques available to them to get out the cut. Bulldozers, chemicals, aircraft for firefighting and things like that. One of the things that they turned to was cutting out all old growth stands in an effort to replace those old growth stands with even-aged, fast-growing timber. And they did this through something called a clear cut. So they're out there getting out the cut. And these are professionally trained foresters with a great deal of esprit de corps who believed in the United States' mission in the world. They believed in the United States in the Cold War struggle, and they were going to get out the timber that the country needed to be strong and to demonstrate the superiority of the American way over communism and the way of the Soviet Union. So I think it's really important to remember that the Forest Service starts out small-scale, democratic, grassroots, servants of the local people, the home builder first of all, and all that stuff. But increasingly, it moves away from that to large-scale timber extraction. Now, what happened with that baby boom, it coincided with a moment of profound wealth generation in the United States and a democratization of that wealth. The greatest proportion of the workforce in United States history, about 30%, was unionized. And 30% of the labor force unionized might not seem a lot, but it is way, way, way higher than it is today. And because of that unionization, wages overall were lifted up, and many unionized workers had really good pay, and they had an annual cost of living allowances. So even if you didn't have a college degree, you could start living a middle-class lifestyle, a suburban home, one or more automobiles, paid vacation. And where were all of those families filled with baby boomer children with a brand new station wagon and a paid vacation? Where were they going to go? They started to go to the public lands. They started to go to the national parks and the national forests. Visitation to the public lands skyrockets. And so in a weird sort of way, you know, the extraction and the demographic boom that was driving the production of wealth and generating the ability of these people to go to the public lands, in some ways was rested on that resource extraction, on getting the cut out. And yet when the people went to the forests, what did they see? They saw clear cuts. Mile after mile of clear cuts in some of the places that they had loved. Hunters who believed that habitat for their game was being destroyed, and so forth. So you can see these two movements, the drive to get out the cut, and then the baby boom, the expanded wealth, access of people to recreation runs directly into that. The Forest Service actually, interestingly, had been paying attention to things like recreation and wilderness for quite a while. But it had always taken a backseat to the imperatives of getting out the cut. The Forest Service, 1924, set aside through some administrative orders what essentially was the first wilderness area, the Gila Wilderness down in New Mexico. That's 1924. So the Forest Service has visionaries in it. But yet that is a backdrop, you know, to the larger goal of getting out the cut. People see the clear cuts, they're embittered, they're angry, they take out lawsuits against the Forest Service. And those lawsuits led to some key pieces of legislation. And that's how we set up the Custer Gallatin National Forest plan. But one of the pieces of legislation that's really important is the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969-70, which requires that any federal action or any federal expenditure, any industry regulated by the federal government must undergo a process of environmental review, must have an environmental impact statement. The 1976 National Forest Management Act required every forest to develop a plan. Thus, the plan before us today, the one that's being revised, the one that Virginia and her colleagues have drafted and worked so hard to bring to its present form. Now, in those measures, in the environmental impact statement under NEPA and the forest plans under the NFA, MA, the National Forest Management Act, those also make a strong gesture to democracy, because the law requires the agencies, requires the Forest Service to bring the plans to the people for comment. The people don't have a veto, but the Forest Service is required by law to make public the plans, to make public the various alternatives that the plans are proposing for the management of the forest and so forth. Virginia can explain this to you, but I looked at the astonishing number of public hearings, the number of readings, all of the immense labor that the Forest Service put in to bring the plan to the public and to generate comments and get feedback that would inform the final decision about how the plan would appear. So again, you know, we began with the Forest Service and the use book and the tension between democracy and expertise, and you see it similarly today in the National Forest Management Act and the generation of a plan which requires public input, but also balances that against the expertise of the National Forest Service. So thank you.
So the topics I'm going to cover will be an overview of Forest Service land management planning, a little bit about our public engagement efforts, and then talk about what is actually in the plan with an emphasis on the Bozeman area and Hyalite Canyon. So first, let me start with some orientation to the Custer Gallatin National Forest. and the Custer National Forest combined with the Gallatin National Forest in 2014. So now we have a forest that stretches from the Montana-Idaho border near West Yellowstone on into eastern Montana and the northwest corner of South Dakota. So please keep this map in mind when we talk about our public meetings. The forest is a little over 3 million acres, and with such a wide geographic span, it's a very diverse forest. It has the highest peaks in Montana in the Beartooth Mountains, and out in South Dakota, there are deposits with dinosaur fossils. The only palladium and platinum mine in the United States is located on this forest in the Stillwater area. And out in eastern Montana, there are very large grazing programs in the Sioux and Ashland Ranger districts. And also, this is an area, especially in the greater Yellowstone area, where the native wildlife still roam. Grizzly bears, wolves, bison, we've got it all here. So what is a forest plan? And I really thank Mark's introduction. It creates a vision for the forest, a comprehensive vision that integrates all of the resources. And it sets overall management direction for years to come. And I want to say it's not the kind of plan that says we're going to do this trail over here or that project over there, but it sets the rules for all of the projects that are going to come. So it may say we plan to do so many habitat improvement projects over a decade, but it won't say where and when and which ones. But all of the projects that the Forest Service is going to do now have to be compliant with this plan. So if we do a trail project or a weed project or a timber project, that project needs to be designed to comply with this plan. And that's why it's such an important plan. So why are we revising it? Well, it's the law. The National Forest Management Act of 1976 requires a forest plan for every forest, and it also requires that it be periodically revised. And while the law might say every 10 to 15 years, the current plans were actually created in the mid-80s, 1986, 1987. So it's a big lift, quite expensive and time-consuming for a forest to revise its plan, and so they don't often get done every 10 to 15 years. So we do have two plans now for one forest, and those plans, the Custer plan and the Gallatin plan, are quite different. So it's time to combine the two plans into an integrated plan for the forest. And in 30 years, a lot has changed. Increased population on the west side of the forest, but there's places on the east side of the forest that population has actually declined. We're seeing bigger fires, new invasives, especially aquatic invasive species. We've had land exchanges, so the actual land base is changing. And we certainly see new technology, new uses, and new interests for the forest. So it's definitely time to revise this plan. So it's a 5-year process so far. We launched in 2016, and any planning process will start with an inventory. Basically, what have you got out there? And we wrote an assessment of existing conditions. So it's a report and maps. And then we had a proposal. We came out with a proposal and asked for public comment. In 2019, we developed a draft plan with alternatives and the draft environmental impact statement. Again, take public comments. And then last July, we're calling it the 2020 plan because it's not quite the final plan, the final EIS and a draft decision. So we're in the last phase. We're working through the objections we received, and we hope to be out with the final plan and EIS and the final decision late summer, early fall. So public engagement, as I mentioned, a number of times we had public engagement. Well, we've had easily over 100 in-person meetings and webinars. And again, think of the geographic span of the forest. We've had meetings in West Yellowstone and Big Sky and Bozeman and Gardner and Cook City and Livingston and Big Timber and Columbus and on east on into Ashland, Montana, Camp Crook, South Dakota. So it was a lot of road trips. We saw a lot of Montana. We take public comment at each plan phase. We've had the tribal consultation. We're working with like 18 or 19 different tribes that range from Oregon and Washington, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and North and South Dakota. A lot of interest from tribes. A lot of agency involvement, other federal, state, local agencies, and youth engagement as well. So the plan, a wide range of topics that we need to cover in the plan, and provide an integrated plan for ecological sustainability while also contributing to social and economic sustainability. It's all about sustainability. The Forest Service revised its planning regulations in 2012 with a big emphasis on sustainability and integration. So all the topics you can see on the word cloud there: plan direction for water, for riparian areas, for wildlife, for fish, for cultural resources, minerals, timber, grazing, air quality, soils, on and on. So there is plan direction for all of these resources. And in addition, plans also develop land allocations. You might say similar to zoning if you think about it that way. And so they may set additional plan direction for those specific areas on top of all of the resource protection. So in the plan that we released last July in 2020, the plan had 7 recommended wilderness areas, 13 backcountry areas, and a backcountry area it's a protection category, but does allow more uses than recommended wilderness. 10 recreation emphasis areas. I think that's a well-named title, pretty self-explanatory. We have the Stillwater Complex for those important minerals, 2 key linkage areas for wildlife connectivity, and then 30 rivers and streams were identified as eligible for wild and scenic rivers. So let's go to the maps. I like maps. And I'm going to go east to west. On the east side of the forest, you don't see a lot of land allocations. You see some backcountry areas in gold and some existing national natural landmarks, but there aren't a lot of land allocations there. So if there's no color on the map, that means you follow all that forest-wide direction and maybe something specific for Ashland and Sioux. So there is plan direction. But the fact that there are fewer land allocations, it's reflective of the uses there, as well as of the public's and the public interest there. Now we'll go to the west side of the forest, and the maps get a little more complicated. So I don't know if you can see my mouse at all, but here we are in Bozeman. And these maps show both the existing allocations like designated wilderness and the land allocations of the plan, with just kind of an overview with green for recommended wilderness, gold for backcountry areas, pink for recreation emphasis areas. There's a blue hatch north of the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness for the Stillwater Complex, and then a heavy brown outline for key linkage areas on the west side of the Bridgers and the north side of the Gallatins. So let's zoom in a little bit on the Bozeman area, starting with the Bridger Mountains. Again, our plan in 2020, on the west side of the Bridger Mountains, the heavy brown line is a key linkage area. And the idea with those is to limit uses and really for wildlife dispersal. The greater Yellowstone ecosystem, the idea is to allow for dispersal from this ecosystem on, particularly up to the Northern Continental Divide. So some uses are limited in there for that purpose. At the northern end of the Bridgers is a backcountry area around Blacktail Peak. Again, and then around Bridger Bowl, not surprisingly, a recreation emphasis area around Bridger. At the south end of the Bridger Mountains is a blue circle, Lyman Springs recharge area, and this is important for Bozeman's water supply. Okay, now let's look at the northern end of the Gallatin Mountains. And again, here we have Bozeman right at the top of the map. So let me try, okay, pink are recreation emphasis areas. There's one along the Gallatin River, around Stormcastle, and the Hyalite recreation emphasis area. The blue, heavy blue outline, the Bozeman Creek watershed, Hyalite Creek watershed. Again, these are very important watersheds for Bozeman's city water supply. The gold is the West Pine Backcountry area, and then to the south we have the a recommended wilderness area, and the heavy purple outline is the wilderness study area. And then the heavy brown line is the key linkage area. So you can see that Hyalite is in context with the surrounding lands, and you can see the emphasis in Hyalite relative to the emphasis on the areas around it. And let's just zoom in a little more about Hyalite, again, from our plan in 2020. And here the base map is like a regular visitor map, so it's a little easier maybe to orient yourselves. So the pink, again, is the Hyalite recreation emphasis area, and it's delineated for the entire watershed, even though the south half or the south portion of that watershed's in the wilderness study area. Just because it's a recreation emphasis area doesn't mean every acre is developed for recreation. But a recreation emphasis area are those places on the forest that already see a high level of recreation and provide opportunities for a wide variety of recreation, a wide range of skills, accessible at different seasons. So it's an area where we see a lot of recreation now, and we can expect to continue to see recreation. In Hyalite, it will be, the challenge will be sustainable recreation with increasing demand. And we can foresee that demand will continue to increase. And so it's about sustainable recreation for the recreation visitor, as well as sustainability ecologically as well. So in Hyalite recreation area, the riparian management zones apply just like anywhere on the forest, the guidance to protect wildlife, etc. At the same time, with a recreation emphasis. So in some of the land allocations, current or future uses may be limited, but not typically in a recreation emphasis area. The current uses continue. There's an emphasis on partnerships, certainly is important. We have one of the partners here tonight speaking this evening. It's a municipal watershed, as I've said, for Bozeman. So it's an important partner, and it's an important use for the city of Bozeman. Some of the areas we'd want to emphasize in the future is more day use along the reservoir. That's pretty prime real estate. So increasing day use, loop trail opportunities, exploring if there's any opportunities for alternative transportation. And one of the few limitations in a recreation emphasis area in this one would be no new trails to the high peaks at the south end of the watershed. And then let's look at Hyalite in context of the surrounding areas. Most of those surrounding areas are going to have more limitations than the recreation emphasis area. So to the south in the green is recommended wilderness. To the east is a backcountry area. Also to the east is a key linkage area. So where new development is limited, timber harvest can still occur, but there has to be periods after activity, has to be periods of rest. Again, kind of more quiet for animals to disperse. So it's an interesting to look at emphasizing Hyalite at the same time, adjacent to Hyalite, things will be more limited. New uses in particular may be more limited. So that's just kind of a brief overview of the plan, where we've been, where we're going, and with a little emphasis on Hyalite.
Hello. I want to thank Virginia for doing the overview on the forest plan revision, and she mentioned a few things about Hyalite, and I'd like to go ahead and share my screen here and give you some more details on what's going on in Hyalite. All right, I'm going to give, first of all, kind of an introduction to the Friends of Hyalite. Some people may be familiar with our organization, but some may not. We're a nonprofit organization. We consist primarily of a board of directors, all volunteers. There's no pay involved. And the Friends of Hyalite was originally started back in 2010 by the ice climbers. They were concerned about the ability to access the ice climbing resources up at the end of the canyon. And it was started to raise money to keep the road plowed through the wintertime. Friends of Hyalite raises money and contributes an average of $13,000 per year towards road plowing, and this keeps the area open for people, not just ice climbing, but it also gives opportunities for cross-country skiing, backcountry skiing, ice fishing, even things like ice hockey, fat biking, snowmobiling, and so forth. They're all able to do that, what they do, because of the road plowing that we do, that we fund. After a while, Friends of Hyalite began to expand their role and partnership with the Forest Service, and we began becoming more involved in some of the other stewardship activities. One of the things that Friends of Hyalite does is we have spring and fall cleanup days. We invite the public to come up and help clean up some of the trash and debris from fires and so forth that accumulate during the winter and over the summertime. It cleans up tons of trash that have been removed from the forest in the last 10 years. And it provides an experience not only for people to be involved in giving back to Hyalite, but also encourages people to really enjoy and experience more of what Hyalite has to offer. One of the things that we've been involved with in partnership with the Forest Service is removing old fencing. There was a grazing allotment in Hyalite for many, many years, and that was retired. And there was barbed wire fence that was left behind from the grazing allotment. And we've had summertime crews go up and remove some of the old barbed wire fence. And this makes Hyalite a safer place for people and also for the pets. We've seen like dog collars caught in the fence and so forth. Excuse me. And also wildlife, because the fence has the ability to catch deer and so forth and snag them. So this is a really important project that we're involved with. Friends of Hyalite has also been able to raise money for improvements. We've done things such as installing larger pallet-sized fire grates in some of the areas so that people who go up there and burn pallets have a place to do it suitably. We also raised money for new picnic tables, and one of our projects is raising money for the Hyalite Steward. The Hyalite Steward is a Forest Service employee who stays up in Hyalite in the summertime and helps to supervise what's going on up there and help visitors have a more enjoyable experience in Hyalite. Friends of Hyalite is also involved in educating the public about what's going on in Hyalite. One of the most important things that Virginia mentioned was that Hyalite is a major source of water for the city of Bozeman, and that we need to protect the resources to keep the water clean. We do social media updates. We have a Facebook page. We have a website. We also do interviews on TV and newspaper, keep people up to date on what's going on up in Hyalite. Another thing that we do is we have recreation maps that we sell for both summer and winter so that people can learn more about the activities and resources that are available in Hyalite. One of the other things that we've become involved with is what we call traffic counters, or vehicle traffic counters. Friends of Hyalite purchased and maintains vehicle counters. They sit by the side of the road, and as a vehicle goes by, it ticks and records that vehicle going by. It provides accurate data on the number of people actually using Hyalite. And this is information that we collect and then give to the Forest Service, to the district ranger, so he has accurate numbers every month of how many people are going up Hyalite. For example, in 2019, the total number of vehicles was over 150,000 in that year, but it increased in 2020 to over 190,000. And so what we're seeing is an increase in vehicle traffic. And specifically, I want to bring your attention to the increase in 2020 over 2019. The blue line is 2019 number of vehicles. In 2020, you can see the second half of 2020, there was a significant increase in traffic of Hyalite. And so we figured that these are people who were trying to get out from their quarantine situations. They want to get out and exercise and enjoy the resources up in Hyalite. The Gallatin Valley is also increasing population. Part of the pandemic has made it so that a lot of people work from home and they can move to places like Bozeman and still keep their jobs, even though they originally were from California or the East Coast. So we're seeing a lot more people out there in Hyalite. We're seeing people up on the tops of the peaks. If you go up on top of Mount Blackmore in July, you'll see a scene like this with people all over the place up on the top of the peak. It used to be years ago, you'd go up to the top of Mount Blackmore and be the only person there, but not so anymore. And in the wintertime, there are what we call backcountry moguls. Places like History Rock and Lick Creek see a lot of people who ski up, and then in the open areas they'll ski down, and it creates moguls just like in a ski area. So that's showing you that there's a lot of use in these areas, both in the summer and the wintertime. Another thing that we're seeing is that there's more demand for trails. In particular, we hear from mountain bikers who are complaining that there's not enough trails available. But we also hear similar complaints from other groups like the snowmobilers and other motorized users. As an offshoot of that, one of the things that happens is that some of these users create their own trails. The mountain bikers create unauthorized trails with jumps and ramps in places where it's supposed to be a quiet area, and yet they're going ahead and building these trails, and it's not exactly what the forest plan is recommending for that area. Another thing that we see up in Hyalite are transient camps. This picture shows the Friends of Hyalite on one of our volunteer nights cleaning up a transient camp that we found up Hyalite last summer. There was a huge pile of trash that was left behind by the transients, and we collected all the trash and hauled it out to the road so that it could be collected. But this is a sign of people who are unable to find places to live in Bozeman, and they seek refuge by going up and camping out for months at a time up in Hyalite. And this is not exactly an allowed use. It's not something that's included in the forest plan, but it's something that's happening that we need to be aware of. Another one of the big problems that we see up Hyalite are pallet fires. Especially in the wintertime, people will go up Hyalite and build fires with pallets and have a big party and drink a bunch of beer or whatever they do. And sometimes they'll be so incapacitated when they leave that the fires are still burning when they leave. And someone might come up the next day and find the smoldering embers of the fire still going. But the biggest problem with the pallet fires are the nails. There's literally hundreds of nails that are in each pallet. And when they're burned, these nails are just littered all over the ground. And if it's an area like, and you can see in this picture, that's a driveway into the Langer campground where this pallet fire was. And the young man there has a magnet. And if you look very carefully, you can see there's a bunch of nails that have been brought up by the magnet, attached to the magnet that we're using to clean up those nails. They also create a damage to the pavement in the parking lots. So we're seeing that there's an increase of people using Hyalite, and the demand for recreational resources is growing as the population grows, and the impact is just growing at an alarming rate up Hyalite. This picture shows the day use area, the reservoir. You can see the beautiful peaks in the background, but you can also see that the parking lot is packed with vehicles. Again, to emphasize how important water is, Hyalite Creek and Sourdough Creek provide 80% of Bozeman's drinking water, and the demand for water is increasing as the population in the Gallatin Valley grows. Plus, the fact that you having more people in Hyalite increases the chance for the water supply to become polluted. Hyalite is also the home for a variety of wildlife. These are mountain goats up near Mount Blackmore. And the problem is that they need a place too. They live up there. It's the home for the wildlife. But if people get too close to the wildlife, it bothers them and they will feel threatened. And it's not a good situation for the wildlife. The other thing that Virginia mentioned was the wilderness study area at the southern end of Hyalite is part of the Hyalite Porcupine Buffalo Horn Wilderness Study Area. And this is critical habitat. People have actually seen wolverines up here, and there are other species such as whitebark pine that are dwindling because of climate change. So these are all factors that we need to be aware of as well. So the Friends of Hyalite would like to see the forest plan include a balance between conservation and recreation. We understand the value of conserving the wild character of this beautiful place that we have in our backyard, but we also know that there's a real demand for recreational opportunities. We need to see a balance between those two different needs in our forest plan.
Hello, everybody. This is Jono McKinney. It's good to see you all, including Avery Berg, a former classmate of my son, so that's kind of been fun. So I'm the president and CEO for the Montana Conservation Corps, and we are another important partner with the Forest Service. So I'll be talking about that and bringing a little bit more perspectives here. But I did want to go back and reflect a little bit on some of the remarks from Dr. Fiege and Virginia Kelly and Peter Bennett. You know, Hyalite is this remarkable little place that encompasses so much of this history we've been hearing about, and this mix of, you know, timber and water and so many other uses, including, you know, the recreation aspects, and this challenge between balancing kind of the conservation, recreation, and other uses in this really small landscape with increasing uses. So I'll be speaking a little bit about that too. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Montana Conservation Corps, and I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. So let me see here. Melissa, if you could let me know, or Carol, Carolyn, if you could give me a thumbs up if you're seeing it. There we go. Okay. I think that works. Get things out of the way. So Montana Conservation Corps' mission is to inspire young people through hands-on conservation service to be leaders, stewards of the land, and engage citizens who improve their communities. Like the Friends of Hyalite, we are also a nonprofit organization. We're based here in Bozeman, but we also have regional offices in Helena, Kalispell, and Missoula, where our crews and our interns serve all across Montana, but actually also in Idaho, Wyoming, and North and South Dakota. So we actually span the Custer Gallatin fully from east to west, but with lots of activities here. And I would say, you know, Montana Conservation Corps, we weave together leadership development, teamwork, civic engagement, and work skills training with direct service on the environment. Those are some of the kinds of projects that we do in places like Hyalite Canyon. And through that, we help young people experience the full measure of their character and discover their capacity to lead changes in their communities, but even more importantly, in their own lives. So I want to go back with a little bit of history also to the roots of the Conservation Corps movement. And this really started in 1933 when President Franklin Roosevelt created the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was one of the very first of his kind of New Deal programs. And when he created the Civilian Conservation Corps, he said, I propose to create a Civilian Conservation Corps to be used in simple work. So that was actually getting projects done, building trails, bridges, a lot of the infrastructure in our national forests and national parks. But he also added that more important, however, than the material gains, the work done, will be the moral and spiritual value of such work. And that really established this dual mission that youth and conservation corps all across the country still have today, this idea of doing important priority conservation work largely in our public lands, but balancing that with the development of young people. So that's fundamental to MCC. We really believe in connecting our core members to people, to a sense of their own power, connecting them to place and heritage and culture, and also giving them a sense of future pathways and ways to be engaged in their communities. And we believe that by connecting people to people, power, place, and pathways, we help them connect to a sense of purpose. The kinds of programs that we have include young adult AmeriCorps field crews, our individual placement programs with interns. We have a number of those actually placed with the Gallatin National Forest this summer. We also have a youth corps program for high school students. You might be one of them. I can't remember if you did our programs or not. And then also we work with different indigenous communities and form partnerships to support opportunities for youth on our reservation communities. What do we do? As you see from this photo, all kinds of different projects. And a lot of that is happening right here in Hyalite Canyon and across the Gallatin National Forest. We do a lot of, obviously the biggest thing we do is a lot of trail work. We do about 1,000 miles of trail maintenance every year. But we're also doing fuels reduction, invasive species work, historic preservation, some visitor use monitoring, and other kinds of resource inventory and study. So a real mix of different kinds of activities. Mostly using traditional hand tools. We're using a lot of the same tools as the folks in the Civilian Conservation Corps used in the 1930s. But as you see, also some chainsaws. So I want to connect this really to our landscape here and why the Conservation Corps and this opportunity to engage young people is really important to the stewardship of places like Hyalite and why it's relevant to this management plan. I was reading through the National Forest plan, and it really describes this forest and particularly this area as a world-class wildlands adventure, is for world-class wildlands adventures. And that really captures kind of the character. People are traveling from all around the world to come and recreate here. And it is world-class recreation surrounded by the richness of the Yellowstone ecosystem. The forest as a whole has about 3,000 miles of trails from east to west. A lot of that is concentrated pretty close to home here. And it is the #1 recreation, has the most recreation visits of any forest in the northern region. 3.5 million visits was in the forest plan, and that was based on 2014. What I found interesting is that in 2009, between 2009 and 2014, they saw a 66% increase in visitation on the Custer Gallatin National Forest. That's an astounding growth. And extrapolating with that same growth rate, if we start with the 3.5 million in 2014 and extrapolate that with 66% growth, we're approaching 6 million visitors on the Custer Gallatin National Forest. A lot of those are close to home. 60% of the visitors travel less than 25 miles. So that, most of those people is us. And what's interesting is a lot of the recreation that we see on the Custer Gallatin is described as dispersed recreation. It's people coming here to hike, ride their bikes, mountain biking or road biking, hunting, fishing, enjoying nature, and then in the winter months, skiing and snowmobiling. So the forest has to absorb this very dispersed, wide-ranging form of recreation and manage for that. What's interesting, while we're seeing this incredible growth in use of the forest, and this is just the recreation, keep in mind the Forest Service is still managing for timber, for water. Hyalite Reservoir is our watershed, all these other uses. But over the last decade, the Forest Service here has seen a 15% decline in their operating and recreation budget. And that's what makes groups like the Friends of the Hyalite so critical. 9% less funding for trails and an overall 28% decline for facilities and maintenance. So a huge management challenge from this increasing use with diminishing resources. Climate change is also adding a whole new factor of challenges with the proliferation of weeds, increasing wildfires, increasing concerns about the ability of our watershed to sustain a growing community like Bozeman. So this, a key finding in the forest plan is summarized here. Maintenance and capital improvements needed for existing public uses of infrastructure, trails, roads, education, and public service routinely exceeds the fiscal capability of the Custer Gallatin, and the demand for increased recreation opportunities shows no indication of decreasing. So our forest has a big challenge, and this plan is going to be critical to managing these resources. One of the essential, strategies that's articulated in the plan is the increasing need and reliability on partnerships. The forest has about 150 agreements with different partner groups like Friends of the Hyalite, Montana Conservation Corps, Backcountry Horsemen, all these different kind of groups that can assist in a lot of ways. And the forest is putting out about $4 million with these groups to help accomplish priority work. As Peter said, some of these groups are also helping raise money for the forest, which is critical and essential through different kinds of grants, recreational trails grants, and things like that. But these partnerships are important because they're a way for the forest to get its stewardship and management responsibilities met in a way that is cost savings. It has benefits of increasing community involvement, which helps to address some of the education, helping us as constituents be invested in the care of these forests. And then another aspect, which is important for us at the Montana Conservation Corps, is workforce development. So MCC, a little bit about some of the work that we've done on the Custer Gallatin, some of that right here in the Hyalite area, is we have both conservation interns, anywhere from 3 to 5 to 11-month long individual placements, as well as a crew program. And combined, in 2019, we accomplished, and this is actually forest-wide in Region 1 of the Forest Service, a little bit over 1,000 miles of trail work, 2,500 acres of weed treatment, 16,000 hazard trees removed, so that's clearing trails a lot of times. We also are involved in some fuels reduction projects, usually around recreation sites like campgrounds. With MCC, the Forest Service contributes about $2.5 million towards the expenses to support those kinds of activities. So this is a major important partnership for the Forest Service. But in reflection, MCC brings about 3.2 million dollars in a matching share. Some of that is in kind, some of that is also dollars from grants and things like that that we contribute to that overall partnership. So again, emphasizing that with these increasing needs and challenges for the forest, diminishing resources, the role of partners is essential and is emphasized within that management plan. So again, what partners bring is resource stewardship and all kinds of different activities. Peter described some of the cleanup, some of the trail work, but also invasive species work, fuels reduction, restoration of different kinds of habitat on the forest. Watershed, one of the interesting projects that we're doing more and more at the Conservation Corps is building what are called these one rock dam analogs. They're fake dams, but what we're trying to do is high in watersheds is create small, one rock high dam structures that help keep some of the water higher up in the watershed, so that during our spring runoffs, which are happening earlier and earlier, more of that water is retained higher up in the watershed. Good for habitat, good for forests, frankly, good for our watershed and municipal needs too. So a variety of different kinds of projects there. Some of our interns are also helping the Forest Service with a variety of different visitor use, resource monitoring, inventory kinds of projects. Again, adding to the workforce for the Forest Service. Interestingly, by getting young people involved in these projects, we're helping young people connect to these as a professional career, gaining skills, becoming good leaders in teams who have good communication skills that can be part of the Forest Service workforce. Certainly, we impart a strong work ethic, teaching backcountry and leave no trace skills. And more importantly, and this is an important contribution that the partner makes, the Forest Service makes, is when they work with partner organizations like MCC, they provide a lot of education. Some of that is talking about what are the Forest Service priorities? What are some of the processes to develop these management plans? What are career opportunities within the agency? And so that's important for developing a workforce because a significant proportion of the Forest Service workforce nowadays is eligible to retire. So we really need to create the next generation of forest stewards and Forest Service employees. And these kinds of opportunities to get engaged are really, really critical for that. And then another important piece here is addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is important for MCC in terms of our recruitment, the culture of our crews and programs. And it's a way that we can help these public agencies also become more current, become more diverse, hiring our core members, and address issues of equity to become more inclusive and reflective so that access to this recreation is available to all. But I want to go back to where I started. Let me check my time here. I think I need to wrap up. Going back to the reason President Roosevelt created the Civilian Conservation Corps. He talked about getting simple work done, but then he also said more important than the material gains will be the moral and spiritual value of such work. And that is still very much the core value for us at the Conservation Corps of this kind of work, this opportunity to work on public lands. MCC does not own any public lands. We don't own any of these projects. These are our American public lands, and we're fortunate to have partners like the Forest Service that provide us opportunities to involve young people in meaningful work that's challenging, where they have to work together, work through challenges, and develop skills. And that is a really transformational experience. So it's a win-win partnership for these organizations with the Forest Service. And this is just a quote from one of our participants. MCC shapes my mind, work ethic, commitment to the environment, and my own community. MCC instilled a sense of accountability, pride, and purpose when it comes to matters of my community, the environment, and my own impact on every person and the land I engage with. It made me hold myself to a higher standard and to know that I can always make a difference in everything around, no matter how big or small. These kinds of outcomes are part of the value and part of the mission of the Forest Service in developing these kinds of partnerships, because we're developing this next generation of stewards and hopefully a next generation workforce too. I want to conclude here with just a few exciting things I think speak to the future for the Forest Service and these partnerships. One of these occurred last summer. It was the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act of 2020, a big bill to address a lot of the deferred and backlog maintenance needs on our public lands. And that basically earmarks about $285 million annually for the Forest Service for the next 5 years to invest in rebuilding and improving some of this infrastructure, roads, trails, campgrounds, those kinds of things that are being impacted by so much use. Hopefully we'll see some of that money coming onto the Gallatin National Forest and right here into Hyalite Canyon, which has so much visitation. The other thing that's very exciting right now is President Biden and his big jobs bill has included a civilian climate corps. So part of that $10 billion proposal is to engage more young people serving on public lands to help improve the waters, the trails, the recreational assets, the health of our ecosystems, and so on. And so this is a great opportunity for the Forest Service, to expand its interest and its commitment to these kinds of partnerships as a way to help support these resources. Again, the forest plan helps us set these priorities and set a future direction. And for the Gallatin National Forest, I think it's going to be really essential, given the limited resources and the high needs. And it's an opportunity for very fruitful partnerships with community groups working with our public lands. All right, thanks, Melissa. That's what I have.
Incredible. Thank you, Mr. McKinney. So to start, I think we can all agree who are on the call. A big thank you to our panelists for those incredible talks and giving us different perspectives on the Custer Gallatin Forest Revision Plan. I know I've loved getting to learn more about it as an avid recreation user and someone who considers themselves an environmental steward. And so with that, we are going to be moving into our Q&A portion of the evening. So what we would like to ask you guys to do is, if you have any questions for the panelists, please type in the chat question and then dash whatever your name is, and that way I can kind of create a virtual queue so I can call on everybody and you can then ask your questions to panelists and they will kind of decide. You can either ask a specific question to a panelist and or we can leave it open-ended and panelists can chime in with their expertise. So we'll go ahead and give a minute for some questions to start lining up in the chat. And I know that me and my colleagues might have some as well.
Mel, can I jump in real quick as people are composing their thoughts?
Go for it. Yeah, I know we had a lot of incredible information to kind of digest.
So I'd be curious to hear from all four of the panelists, but maybe starting with Ms. Kelly first. What is success from your perspective for the forest plan sort of look like? And that might be in terms of the process of its development, its final content, or its effect on the landscape. But what would a successful forest plan look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. Hitting the mark, I think, on sustainability. Hitting the mark on sustainability ecologically, socially, economically, culturally. If we can do that, create a sustainable plan for a sustainable forest, that would be success for me.
Excellent. Well, it looks like we have a couple questions in the chat. So Finley, if you'd like to go ahead and ask your question, we'd love that.
Hi. So my question is for Mrs. Kelly. Seeing how the forest plan that you are wrapping up now began in 2016 and it's now 2021 and it's finishing up. How much is a forest plan impacted by changing administrations, I guess, nationally and locally, especially because it's going through, I think it's two states. So I was just curious about that.
Okay, great. That's another great question. So the Forest Service needs to follow the laws and needs to follow the regulations. And this might be kind of a long answer, but the Forest Service first wrote its planning regulations in 1982. And all the forest plans had to follow that regulation. And then they updated the regulations in 2012. So regardless of the administration, we're all following the same rules to create the plan. So in my experience, it's been quite a long experience, like 30 years in the Forest Service. The day-to-day work of the Forest Service, really, I haven't experienced changes that much in administrations or Congress as well. Congress is who's developing the budgets. They set the budgets. And so different things may be emphasized in different administrations, recreation, for instance. Other administrations might emphasize timber. But the day-to-day work of the Forest Service, is the work that we need to do. It's weeds and recreation and fish and wildlife. And I really, this plan is the plan of this forest and the public that participated in it. That's how I would say it, as opposed to any particular administration.
Thank you.
Yeah, and kind of building off of that, Finley, with Dr. Fiege, I'd be interested to know, in your expertise, have you, historically speaking, seen a large shift between kind of political ideologies when it comes to environmental history?
Yeah, good question. And I would say that in some ways, it's not just a shift from executive administration to executive administration, but there are social changes that, eventually shape the Forest Service and the National Forest. So, for example, the generation of foresters that were really in charge of the forest, say in the 1950s and 1960s, these were mostly men, mostly white men, mostly foresters and civil engineers. Many of them were military veterans. They were thoroughly imbued with the Cold War values and objectives of the United States. And, in many ways, they were heroes. And conservation was a heroic enterprise of stewarding the land and getting out the resources, but there were problems with what they were doing. I've met some at a meeting of the Colorado, it's a American Society of Foresters in the Colorado chapter of that. It was an annual meeting, and I met a retired U.S. Forest Service forester, and he told me, yeah, back in the old days, people would object to what we were doing, and we'd say to them, shut up and sit down. We're the experts. And he admitted that they'd made mistakes, and that was not really any way to treat anybody. But what happens is the environmental movement comes along. And then suddenly these guys who had been the heroes were, they in some ways turned into the bad guys. And I think that deeper social, cultural, political change really hurt them. After the 1964 Civil Rights Act and with second wave feminism, women start to make their way into the agency. A lot of those women arrive in the agency beginning in the 1970s, and that's known as the environmental decade. I don't think it's an accident that Virginia Kelly's talking to us, that the forest supervisor is Mary Erickson, and so forth. And so I think there are just sort of deeper currents of social change, economic change, and political change that can sometimes run against the dominant organizational culture of the Forest Service, but then sometimes sweep it up and move it along. And I think that illustrates my larger point that, the public lands and the ledge agencies are never one thing. They've changed over time. And they're remarkably capacious and flexible. My understanding is that the U.S. Forest Service, it's got over 30,000 people in it. It is the single, maybe I'm mistaken, but my understanding is it is the single largest conservation agency on the planet. That is a very cool thing, and it has changed. And I think that means that all of us together as citizens, we can change it if we want to. And it can become a good thing. And it's something that we should be very reluctant to let go of. Hope that helps.
Mark, I want to add something on your comment. I think that speaks to this cultural shift. I think it's a continuing cultural shift. And whereas the Forest Service, you spoke about having kind of this culture of professionals and many professional foresters who are really running it. that is continuing to change as the resources are beneath the need, really, and the Forest Service is having to rely on more and more on partnerships. And I think where the forest part of that shift is going from professional foresters to professional partner managers and partner coordinators, for lack of a better word. We no longer necessarily have a lot of full Forest Service trail crews. Instead, we have a wilderness manager or ranger who's working with a conservation corps crew out there that's doing the work. And so really developing the capacity of the agency to effectively use these kinds of partnerships is a change in culture from being those original stewards to now being the stewards and managers of these kinds of partnerships and sharing that stewardship with a broader group of stakeholders. That is requiring changes in the field. It's also requiring administrative changes for the agency in how does it do partnerships. And I think it's 2 years ago, a bill passed called the Forest Service Trails Act, which was specifically at addressing frustrations from many volunteer groups that simply there were so many administrative barriers to volunteer groups being able to help the Forest Service. And so it's just reflecting of a 21st century Forest Service is a different kind of professional than it was in the 19th and 20th century.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would echo. I've certainly seen the evolution. The Forest Service has definitely evolved in so many ways culturally. It's become more of an ecosystem management agency. So definitely over the decades, we definitely have seen that evolution. I definitely echo that.
Awesome. Well, great question, Finley. Thank you for getting that kind of set up. And then it looks like we'll end off with a question from Thomas.
Yeah, thank you all. This is a really interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask, given that the last forest plan for both Custer and Gallatin National Forest was made in the 80s and a lot has changed since then, I wanted to ask how the new plan addresses climate change, since that's so dominant in discourse today about land management and ecological research, and what changes have been made from the previous plan to the current one to factor in climate change and adapting to that in current forest management.
Okay, great question. How does the plan incorporate climate change? So the new rules I was talking about that came about in 2012 require us to look at climate change, among other topics. And the way we look at it is how we manage the land. And the theory being, if the land, the vegetation in particular, is the building blocks for wildlife habitat, et cetera. So what we do is look at what we call the natural range of variation. So we look back 500 years, we model back to 1,000 years with the idea that that is basically the vegetation, the ecosystem that plants and animals evolved with. And we go back that far in time because, it starts to take into account some of the climate shifts we've seen from like the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age. So the theory being that if we can manage the forest within that range that the plants and animals adapted to, it'll make the forest resilient in the face of the future climate. So that's the approach we take. We weave climate change kind of into the management of the forest. So it's all woven in. So you won't necessarily see a climate change section in the plan because the whole idea it's woven in, and that we're kind of trying to build a resilient forest. It'll be resilient to these changes that are coming. How's that?
Thank you. Can I ask a follow-up? In terms
Sure.
of like specific changes in management related, for example, things like grazing or things like watershed management, are there any specific changes that you see that relate to responding to climate change, particularly increased drought? on the forest?
So let me see, increased drought. Again, well, to answer the first part of your question, so one idea might be we might need to look at our infrastructure and including recreation infrastructure and look at how peak flows might change. We might have more runoff earlier in the season. We might have higher peak flows. So you might need to think about where our infrastructure is located, and if we're going to replace something, maybe you replace it farther out, so it's less susceptible. So those kinds of things. It's not so much though as just responding in specifically to increased drought, but it's more trying to think holistically about just being adaptable and resilient to kind of the range of conditions that we might see.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, Thomas, for another great question. And on that note, it looks like we are running out of time for this evening. So I'd like to say a big thank you for logging on. Also, let's do a brief round of applause to our tremendous panelists this evening. Thank you for sharing with us some of the policy and science behind the Custer Gallatin National Forest Plan revision. And please take the opportunity, if you'd like, to give us some constructive feedback as we learn how to navigate Wheeler Center events this year. You'll find a link in the chat to a survey that will take no more than 2 minutes. Please open now and complete. If you have a couple extra minutes, we'd really appreciate it. And be sure to follow the Burton K. Wheeler Center online and on Facebook. You can just search us. And lastly, thank you so much to our partner, the Montana State University Department of Political Science. And we will be hosting more pizza and politics events next semester. So be on the lookout for any kind of marketing you see for those. And have a great evening, everybody. Thank you so much.